The mountains did not surrender easily. Across the frozen slopes of the Sierra Nevada, thousands of Chinese workers advanced through snow, granite, and isolation, cutting tunnels into the rock and preparing a path for the railroad that would unite the American continent. Their names rarely appeared in newspapers. Their faces were largely absent from official photographs, and their sacrifices were soon pushed to the margins of history. Yet without their labor, one of the greatest engineering projects of 19th century America might never have been completed. Most had crossed the Pacific, carrying the hope of returning home with enough money to rescue their families from poverty and instability. They called California Gamsan, the Gold Mountain. But the promise of wealth quickly gave way to discriminatory taxes, restricted opportunities, low wages, and hostility. Driven from the gold fields and excluded from many occupations, Chinese immigrants became miners, farmers, cooks, factory workers, and railroad laborers. By the 1860s, they formed the backbone of the Central Pacific workforce, building eastward through some of the most difficult terrain in North America. Their work helped connect California to the rest of the United States, accelerate westward expansion, and transform the nation's economy. But once the tracks were finished, admiration gave way to resentment. The same workers who had been considered indispensable were portrayed as a threat, attacked by anti-Chinese movements, and targeted by discriminatory laws. This is the story of the immigrants who helped build modern America, and of the country that rewarded their contribution with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. 1. Why thousands of Chinese workers left their homeland. In the middle of the 19th century, China was home to more people than any other country on Earth, but much of its rural population lived with little economic security. Most families depended on small plots of land that were divided among sons from one generation to the next. As farms became smaller and the population continued to grow, many households struggled to produce enough food or income. A failed harvest, an unexpected tax, or the loss of a tenant agreement could push an entire family into debt. Most Chinese immigrants who traveled to the United States came from Guangdong Province, particularly from districts surrounding the Pearl River Delta. This southern region had long been connected to maritime trade, making foreign ports and overseas employment more familiar than they were in many inland provinces. Canton, now Guangzhou, served as an important commercial gateway, while Hong Kong became a major departure point after it came under British control in 1842. The First Opium War, fought between 1839 and 1842, exposed the weakness of the Qing government and disrupted the economy of southern China. The resulting treaties opened additional ports to foreign merchants and increased Western influence along the coast. Imported goods competed with local production, while political authorities struggled to control smuggling, corruption, and commercial instability. For ordinary families, these changes often produced insecurity rather than prosperity. A second conflict with Western powers began in 1856 and placed further pressure on communities near the southern coast. Military campaigns interrupted trade, damaged local economies, and demonstrated that the Qing government could no longer protect every region effectively. Taxes imposed to support armies added to the burden faced by farmers and laborers. Leaving China gradually became a practical response to conditions that offered few reliable paths forward. At the same time, the Taiping Rebellion devastated large areas of China between 1850 and 1864. Although its greatest destruction occurred farther north and west of the main emigrant districts, the rebellion destabilized the entire empire. Millions of people were displaced, trade routes were disturbed, and the government demanded more money and resources from local communities. News of the conflict deepened the sense that established institutions were breaking down. Guangdong also experienced violent local conflicts of its own. Competition over land, irrigation, employment, and political influence sometimes divided villages and rival social groups. The conflict between Punti and Hakka communities during the 1850s and 1860s displaced many families in parts of the province. Migration, therefore, did not result from a single national crisis, but from several pressures that reached different communities in different ways. Then, in 1848, gold was discovered in California. News crossed the Pacific through merchants, sailors, and letters from early migrants. California became known among many Chinese as Gam San, or Gold Mountain, a name that transformed a distant territory into a symbol of possible wealth. Stories of men earning extraordinary sums spread quickly, even though those accounts often concealed the difficulties and discrimination awaiting newcomers. For most migrants, traveling to California was not an individual adventure, but a family strategy. Relatives might gather money, sell possessions, or borrow from merchants to pay for one man's passage across the Pacific. He was expected to work, live carefully, send remittances home, and eventually return with enough savings to improve the family's position. Migration was usually imagined as temporary, even when circumstances later made permanent settlement more likely. Recruiters, shipping agents, and labor contractors helped turn this hope into an organized migration system. Many workers traveled under credit arrangements that required them to repay the cost of the voyage after finding employment. These agreements could create heavy obligations, but they also made the journey possible for people who could never have paid the full fare in advance. Steamships and expanding commercial networks made the Pacific crossing more regular, connecting southern China directly to San Francisco. By the early 1850s, thousands of Chinese migrants were arriving in California each year. They carried expectations of gold, wages, and eventual return. But they also carried obligations to families and communities left behind. Poverty, war, population pressure, local conflict, and foreign interference had pushed them toward the coast. The promise of California pulled them across the ocean. They did not yet know that America would demand their labor while repeatedly denying them equal treatment. 2. The California Gold Rush and the promise of Gold Mountain. When the first Chinese migrants entered San Francisco Bay, the harbor was crowded with ships carrying people from nearly every corner of the world. The discovery of gold in 1848 had transformed California almost overnight, drawing miners, merchants, laborers, and adventurers from Latin America, Europe, Australia, and Asia. For the newcomers from southern China, the unfamiliar coastline appeared to confirm the stories they had heard about Gam San, the Gold Mountain. The early migrants arrived with carefully prepared plans, most intended to remain in California only long enough to accumulate savings, repay the cost of their passage, and send money to their families. They traveled in groups formed around shared villages, family connections, or regional origins. These associations offered information, temporary housing, employment contacts, and some protection in a society where few newcomers spoke English or understood American laws. San Francisco became the center of Chinese life in the United States. Near the waterfront, merchants established shops, boarding houses, restaurants, and offices that served arriving workers. The neighborhood that would become Chinatown functioned as a bridge between two worlds. Letters, money, supplies, and news traveled through its businesses, connecting labor camps in California with families living thousands of miles away in Guangdong. From San Francisco, groups of workers traveled inland toward the mining regions of the Sierra Nevada foothills. They entered camps along rivers such as the American, Yuba, and Feather, where miners searched through gravel and sediment for particles of gold. By the early 1850s, Chinese laborers had become a visible presence in California's mining districts, often working together under supervisors who coordinated equipment, supplies, and the division of earnings. Many Chinese miners arrived after the most accessible deposits had already been claimed, Instead of abandoning locations considered exhausted, they carefully reworked old claims, tailings, and riverbanks left behind by earlier miners. Their organized methods allowed them to recover small quantities of gold from places others had dismissed. This persistence sometimes produced profits, but it also attracted resentment from miners who believed California's resources belonged exclusively to white Americans. Economic competition soon became inseparable from racial prejudice. Newspapers and political leaders portrayed Chinese miners as outsiders who removed wealth from California without becoming part of American society. Their willingness to accept difficult work was used against them, while the money they sent to relatives in China was presented as evidence that they could never belong. These accusations ignored the businesses they supported, the taxes they paid, and the communities they were already building. California's government turned this hostility into official policy. In 1850, the state introduced a foreign miners' tax requiring miners who were not United States citizens to pay a monthly fee. After the first version was repealed, another tax was introduced in 1852 and increasingly enforced against Chinese workers. Because federal law prevented Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens, they could be treated permanently as foreigners and taxed accordingly. Tax collectors frequently entered mining camps and demanded payment from workers whose earnings were already uncertain. Those unable to pay could lose access to their claims or be forced to abandon the district. The tax generated significant revenue for California, meaning that the state benefited directly from people it refused to treat as equals. During some years, Chinese miners contributed a considerable share of the money collected through the system. Legal inequality left them vulnerable to further abuse. An 1854 decision by the California Supreme Court effectively prevented Chinese witnesses from testifying against white defendants. This reduced their ability to seek justice when they faced robbery, intimidation, or violence. In many mining communities, local rules and informal pressure excluded Chinese workers from promising claims, forcing them into less productive areas or pushing them out of mining altogether. The Gold Mountain had not disappeared, but its meaning was changing. California offered wages that could still exceed what many migrants might have earned in China, yet every opportunity came with taxes, exclusion, and insecurity. As the goldfields declined and hostility increased, Chinese workers began moving into agriculture, laundries, manufacturing, domestic service, and construction. Their search for opportunity would soon lead thousands of them toward a project larger than any mining camp, the railroad across the continent. 3. From the gold mines to the railroad camps. By the beginning of the 1860s, California's goldfields no longer offered the opportunities they once had. The richest surface deposits had been exhausted, and mining was increasingly controlled by companies capable of purchasing expensive machinery. Chinese miners continued to work abandoned claims and less productive areas, but discriminatory taxes and local restrictions made survival increasingly difficult. Many began searching for other ways to earn the money their families depended upon. Chinese immigrants became an essential part of California's expanding economy. They drained swamps and prepared fields for agriculture, worked in fisheries, produced cigars and clothing, opened laundries, cooked in hotels, and performed domestic labor. Their presence allowed towns and businesses to grow, but their work remained poorly rewarded. Employers valued them when labor was scarce, while politicians continued to portray them as people who did not belong. At the same time, American leaders were planning a railroad that would connect the Pacific Coast with the eastern states. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 authorized two companies to build toward each other. The Union Pacific would advance westward from the Missouri River, while the Central Pacific would begin in Sacramento and build eastward. The project promised to reduce a journey of several months to approximately 1 week and strengthen federal control over the West. The Central Pacific faced an immediate problem. California did not have enough available workers for a project of such enormous scale. Many white laborers preferred mining or better-paid employment, while others left railroad camps after only a short time. The Civil War also reduced the supply of labor arriving from the eastern states. Without a stable workforce, construction progressed slowly toward the Sierra Nevada. Company leaders initially doubted that Chinese workers were suited to railroad construction. Prejudice led some supervisors to believe that men who were generally smaller than European and American laborers could not perform demanding physical work. In early 1865, however, the Central Pacific agreed to hire a small group of Chinese workers as an experiment. They proved reliable, organized, and fully capable of completing every task assigned to them. The results changed the company's entire labor strategy. Central Pacific executive Charles Crocker encouraged the recruitment of additional Chinese workers from mining districts, farms, and towns throughout California. Contractors also recruited men directly from southern China when the local labor supply became insufficient. Within a few years, Chinese workers formed the overwhelming majority of the Central Pacific's construction force. The workforce was usually organized into crews under Chinese headmen who communicated with company supervisors. These crews divided responsibilities and maintained clear routines for work, meals, and supplies. Their organization allowed the railroad to coordinate thousands of workers across isolated construction sites. At the height of the project, approximately 10,000 to 12,000 Chinese laborers may have been working for the Central Pacific. Their responsibilities extended far beyond laying rails. Chinese crews cleared trees, moved earth, built retaining walls, prepared embankments, dug drainage channels, constructed bridges, and carried heavy materials across uneven terrain. Others worked as cooks, blacksmith assistants, or specialists responsible for maintaining equipment. Each completed mile required many different forms of labor before a locomotive could safely pass over it. Despite their importance, Chinese workers were not treated equally. They generally received lower wages than white laborers and often had to pay for their own food and lodging. The company considered this arrangement economical, while workers calculated whether enough money remained to send home after expenses. Their employment was essential to the railroad, but that importance did not translate into equal compensation or social acceptance. By the time construction reached the higher elevations of the Sierra Nevada, the Central Pacific depended almost completely on its Chinese workforce. The workers who had once been dismissed as unsuitable were now carrying the western half of the transcontinental project forward. Ahead of them stood granite cliffs, severe winters, and a route that engineers could draw on paper, but laborers still had to carve into the mountains. 4. The workers who crossed the Sierra Nevada. The Sierra Nevada presented the Central Pacific with its greatest obstacle. East of Sacramento, the land rose from open valleys into steep slopes, narrow ravines, and granite peaks more than 2,000 meters above sea level. Surveyors could identify a possible route through the mountains, but every mile required embankments, bridges, cuts, and tunnels. The company's plans depended on whether its laborers could transform an almost inaccessible landscape into a stable railroad. Chinese crews advanced toward the mountains in organized groups, establishing temporary camps as construction moved eastward. Tents and wooden shelters were built close to the work sites, often far from established towns. Supplies had to be transported along rough roads, and communication with Sacramento became increasingly difficult. In these isolated camps, workers depended heavily on one another for food, equipment, information, and support. Their diet differed from the standard meals served in many 19th-century American labor camps. Chinese cooks prepared rice, dried vegetables, seafood, pork, tea, and other familiar foods obtained through merchants in California. Whenever possible, fresh ingredients were added to the meals. This organized supply system provided some continuity with home and helped workers endure long periods in remote mountain camps. The work began with clearing vegetation and preparing the railroad's path. Crews removed trees, leveled uneven ground, constructed retaining walls, and filled depressions with stone and earth. On steep slopes, even transporting tools and materials became a major challenge. Every section had to be carefully shaped because unstable ground could later cause tracks to shift or collapse under the weight of a locomotive. Granite posed an even greater problem. Workers drilled holes into the rock by hand, using heavy hammers and steel drills. The holes were filled with black powder, and later with the more powerful but highly unstable nitroglycerin. After each controlled explosion, crews removed the broken stone and repeated the process. Progress was often measured in only a few inches per day. The most difficult excavation was Summit Tunnel, also known as Tunnel Number 6, near Donner Pass. Workers attacked the granite from both ends, while additional crews descended through a central shaft to create more working faces. The tunnel eventually extended approximately 1,159 feet through the mountain. Its completion required precision because the separate sections had to meet inside the rock with very little room for error. Construction continued through the severe winter of 1866–1867, when deep snow covered the mountains and repeatedly disrupted the work. Temporary shelters protected some tunnel entrances, while passageways were dug through the snow to connect camps and construction sites. Avalanches and storms threatened workers, buried equipment, and interrupted supply lines. Even under these conditions, the Central Pacific pressed its crews to maintain progress. To protect the completed railroad, workers later constructed an extensive system of wooden snow sheds. These structures covered vulnerable sections of track and allowed snow to pass over the railway rather than block it completely. Building them required vast quantities of timber and additional labor across the mountain slopes. The sheds became nearly as important as the tunnels in keeping the route open during winter. The workers also challenged the conditions imposed upon them. In June 1867, thousands of Chinese laborers organized a strike, demanding higher wages, shorter working hours, and better treatment. The Central Pacific refused their demands and used its control over supplies to pressure them back to work. Although the strike ended without achieving its immediate goals, it demonstrated that the workers were capable of coordinated resistance despite language barriers and isolation. When the tunnels were completed and the tracks crossed the summit, company executives celebrated an engineering victory. Yet that achievement belonged largely to the Chinese workers, who had spent years cutting through granite, enduring severe weather, and building across terrain that many observers had considered impossible. Beyond the Sierra Nevada, a different landscape awaited them. But the race to complete the Transcontinental Railroad was only becoming more intense. 5. Building the first Transcontinental Railroad. After crossing the Sierra Nevada, the Central Pacific entered the wide deserts and basins of Nevada. The terrain was less mountainous, but it brought new difficulties. Extreme temperatures, limited water, long distances between settlements, and the constant movement of supplies. Construction camps advanced with the tracks, creating temporary communities that disappeared almost as quickly as they had formed. The Chinese crews worked with remarkable coordination. One group prepared the roadbed, another positioned wooden ties, and others carried iron rails forward from supply trains. Spikes were driven into place, the track was aligned, and gravel was packed beneath the ties. Once a section was completed, the supply train moved forward, and the entire process began again. Speed had become essential because the Central Pacific was competing with the Union Pacific, which was building westward across the Great Plains. Federal subsidies rewarded both companies according to the number of miles they completed, while land grants gave them control of valuable territory alongside the tracks. Every additional mile meant greater financial rewards, encouraging both companies to build as rapidly as possible. The railroad was therefore more than an engineering project. It was also a race for money, land, and political influence. Company executives pressured supervisors to increase productivity, and that pressure passed directly to the workers. Chinese laborers faced longer days and constantly moving camps as the Central Pacific accelerated across Nevada toward Utah territory. Providing water became one of the greatest logistical challenges. Wells had to be dug, water transported in tanks, and supplies carefully distributed among workers and animals. Food, timber, iron, tools, and replacement equipment traveled along the track that had already been completed. The railroad was effectively supplying its own construction, extending itself farther into the interior with each passing day. Despite difficult conditions, the workers developed an efficient rhythm that allowed the Central Pacific to cover increasingly large distances. Crews learned to coordinate each stage so that materials arrived precisely when needed. Their speed was not the result of individual strength alone, but of planning, repetition, and collective discipline. Thousands of separate movements were transformed into a continuous construction system. On April 28, 1869, the Central Pacific staged one of the most famous demonstrations of railroad construction in American history. Chinese and Irish crews laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track in a single day near Promontory, Utah. The achievement required careful preparation and intense coordination, proving how efficient the workforce had become after years of experience. By then, the distance separating the Central Pacific and Union Pacific had almost disappeared. Surveyors selected Promontory Summit in Utah Territory as the place where the two lines would meet. Workers from both companies prepared the final sections, while politicians, businessmen, journalists, and railroad officials traveled to witness the completion of a project once considered nearly impossible. On May 10, 1869, ceremonial spikes were driven into the final tie at Promontory Summit. A telegraph message announced the completion across the country, and celebrations erupted in major American cities. Chinese workers were present at Promontory and participated in the final stages, yet they were largely absent from the famous photographs and public narratives that came to represent the event. The first transcontinental railroad immediately changed the geography of the United States. Travel between the coasts was reduced from months to roughly a week, while goods, mail, migrants, soldiers, and information could move faster than ever before. The achievement was celebrated as evidence of American progress, but the nation rarely acknowledged that this progress had depended on thousands of Chinese immigrants whose labor had carried the Central Pacific from California to Utah. 6. What happened after the railroad was completed. When the final tracks met at Promontory Summit, thousands of Chinese laborers suddenly faced an uncertain future. The Central Pacific no longer needed the same enormous construction force, and many workers were released from the camps. Some had saved enough money to return to China, but others still carried debts or family obligations. For them, the completion of the railroad was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of another search for work. Many remained in the railroad industry. Experienced crews were hired to repair tracks, maintain tunnels, clear mountain routes, and replace damaged sections of the line. Others joined new construction projects in California, Oregon, Washington, and throughout the West. Their knowledge of grading, tunneling, bridge construction, and track laying made them valuable wherever railroad companies attempted to expand. Chinese workers helped construct sections of the Southern Pacific and other regional railroads. They pushed transportation routes through valleys, deserts, and mountain passes, connecting isolated settlements to larger markets. As these lines expanded, mining towns, agricultural districts, and coastal ports became part of a growing Western economy. The workers who had connected the continent continued building the networks that made that connection useful. Others entered agriculture in California's Central Valley and Sacramento's San Joaquin Delta. Chinese laborers cleared fields, harvested crops, dug irrigation channels, and constructed levees that reclaimed large areas of swampy land. Their work helped transform difficult terrain into some of the most productive farmland in the United States. Yet the economic value of this labor was rarely matched by public recognition. In growing cities, Chinese immigrants found employment in factories that produced clothing, shoes, cigars, and other goods. Some worked as cooks, servants, gardeners, and laundry operators. These occupations were not always chosen freely. Discrimination and exclusion from many unions restricted the work available to them. Small businesses often became a practical path to survival when established employers refused to hire Chinese workers. Hand laundries became especially associated with Chinese immigrants because they required relatively little starting capital and could operate in small rented spaces. Laundry work was physically demanding and involved long hours, but it allowed workers to earn income without depending completely on hostile employers. These businesses appeared in towns throughout the West, including communities where few other Chinese residents lived. Many former railroad workers moved into Chinatowns in San Francisco, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and smaller Western settlements. These neighborhoods contained shops, restaurants, temples, boarding houses, medical practitioners, theaters, and mutual aid organizations. They were not simply places of separation from American society. They provided protection, employment contacts, cultural familiarity, and practical assistance in an environment where discrimination shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. Regional and family associations played an important role within these communities. They helped newcomers find housing and employment, settled disputes, arranged medical care, and assisted members who wanted to return to China. Merchants served as intermediaries between Chinese laborers and American employers, while newspapers and letters carried information across the Pacific. Through these institutions, immigrants maintained a connection with their home villages even after years abroad. The Chinese immigrant population remained overwhelmingly male. Most early migrants had expected to work temporarily and return home, while the cost of migration and American restrictions made it difficult for many families to reunite. The Page Act of 1875 further restricted immigration from Asia and was enforced in ways that sharply limited the arrival of Chinese women. As a result, many men spent decades separated from wives, children, and parents in China. By the 1870s, Chinese immigrants had become woven into the economic life of the American West. They maintained railroads, cultivated farmland, manufactured goods, and provided services in cities and remote towns. But their success did not bring security. As the national economy entered a period of crisis, political movements began blaming Chinese workers for problems they had not created, preparing the ground for an organized campaign of exclusion. 7. From essential workers to an excluded population. During the railroad's construction, Chinese workers had been praised whenever their labor increased company profits or accelerated progress. After the project was completed, however, they were increasingly described as an economic threat. The qualities employers had once valued, their organization, reliability, and willingness to accept available work, were transformed into arguments against them. America celebrated the railroad while distancing itself from the people who had built much of it. The Panic of 1873 triggered a severe economic depression across the United States. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment rose, especially in Western cities. Instead of directing public anger toward unstable financial institutions and corporate practices, politicians and labor agitators blamed Chinese immigrants. They claimed that removing Chinese workers would solve unemployment and raise wages, even though the causes of the crisis were national and far more complex. Employers also helped create resentment by using Chinese laborers as a workforce with fewer legal protections and less bargaining power. Chinese workers were often paid less and excluded from many white-controlled unions, making it easier for companies to divide employees along racial lines. Rather than challenging the businesses that established unequal wages, anti-Chinese movements presented the immigrants themselves as the source of the problem. In California, the Working Men's Party turned hostility toward Chinese immigrants into a powerful political campaign. Led by Dennis Kearney, the movement held public demonstrations and demanded an end to Chinese immigration. Its speeches portrayed an entire population as incapable of becoming American, transforming economic anxiety into racial politics. Anti-Chinese messages soon appeared in newspapers, election campaigns, and local government debates. Hostility was not limited to political language. Chinese residents faced intimidation, forced removal, destruction of businesses, and organized violence in several Western communities. Local authorities frequently failed to provide adequate protection or hold attackers accountable. These incidents sent a clear message: immigrants whose labor had been welcomed during economic expansion could be expelled when their presence became politically inconvenient. Discrimination was reinforced by the legal system. Federal naturalization laws prevented Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens, regardless of how long they lived or worked in the United States. Without citizenship, they had limited political influence and could not vote against the officials creating discriminatory policies. State and municipal governments also attempted to restrict Chinese businesses, employment, housing, and movement through specially designed taxes and regulations. The Page Act of 1875 marked an important change in federal immigration policy. Although presented as a measure against forced labor and prostitution, its enforcement severely restricted the entry of Chinese women. Immigration officials often treated women as suspicious and subjected them to intrusive questioning. The law made family formation and reunification more difficult, reinforcing the image of Chinese communities as temporary and overwhelmingly male. California's new Constitution of 1879 reflected the strength of the anti-Chinese movement. It authorized restrictions on the employment of Chinese workers and encouraged local governments to remove them from certain occupations or areas. Some provisions were later challenged or limited by federal courts, but their political purpose was unmistakable. California wanted the national government to stop Chinese immigration entirely. The United States first revised its diplomatic agreement with China through the Angel Treaty of 1880, which allowed the federal government to restrict the arrival of Chinese laborers. Congress then passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, signed by President Chester A. Arthur on May 6, 1882. The law suspended the immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years and confirmed that Chinese immigrants were ineligible for naturalized citizenship, while allowing limited exempt categories such as merchants, students, teachers, travelers, and diplomats. The Chinese Exclusion Act turned racial hostility into national policy and established a system that would become even more restrictive in later decades. The workers who had crossed the Sierra Nevada, laid tracks through the desert, and connected the American coasts now belonged to a population officially marked for exclusion. Their experience revealed a central contradiction in 19th century America. The nation depended on immigrant labor to build its future, yet denied those workers an equal place within the country they had helped create.